Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the front porch. So glad to see you all in this third experiment of the front porch. The first one was Daryl and Adriel and I sitting in the sanctuary with no people. The second one was a few of us met to talk about sexual literacy and parenting in the sanctuary. And today we are so glad to have such a good group here at First Unitarian Church in Dallas. Right here on the front porch, the idea is that it's as if we are sitting on our front porch just having a conversation, but the context is that we have important conversations on the front porch that they're not trivial, but they're here to move us and change us. And so we're going to continue to do this as much as we can, and we're glad you're here. So welcome, welcome, welcome. You can hear me, I'm guessing, because no one's in the back going, I can't hear you. Okay, this is also the first time we've used this sound system in this room, so we're getting there. I want to introduce our guests here on the front porch. First, Jim Watson, who's a member of First Unitarian Church, was born and raised in rural cotton and ranching country in West Texas. He studied liberal arts and law at the University of Texas in Austin, has practiced law in Dallas, and has also taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Texas Law School and SMU in the history field. Jim is a member of our church. Will you welcome Jim?
Thank you.
Pamela Campbell-Bailey is a published author, singer-songwriter. Pamela has an MFA degree in nonfiction creative writing from Queen's University in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a degree in business marketing from South Carolina State University. She worked for many years as an adjunct professor at Dallas Baptist while teaching world literature to her students. Pamela was inspired to create a lyceum to share the music and history of the African American experience that her students felt had largely been absent from their formal educations. As a public scholar, the Antebellum Diaspora Project, which is what Pamela has been working on, provides opportunities to collaborate with scholars in the U.S. and internationally on subjects such as forced migration of American-born enslaved people and the lasting effect of forced family separations on their descendants. Welcome, Pamela. So we're going to cut pretty quickly to the chase here, and I just want to say that the reason Jim is in our church and in this seat here is because he and I met in a coffee line in Chautauqua, New York at the Chautauqua Institute. He turned around and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm the minister of a church in Dallas." And he said, "I live in Dallas." Jim has a knack for meeting people in the oddest places, and that is part of this story, right? Yes. Somehow, that is part of this story. So, Pamela, tell us the story of your meeting.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Reverend Cantor for having me here and for Jim for helping to get this together. And I want to thank you all for being here today. It is a lovely opportunity to tell you a little bit about my ancestors and to honor them in that way. So thank you so much. You've been very welcoming and I appreciate it. So our meeting, as we said, was a little serendipitous. A little bit about my background. I was raised in South Carolina. And I was raised near the places where my family had been enslaved. I didn't really know that other than through stories that my father told me or music that my mother gave me, that this was sort of where my family had been for many, many generations. And for many years, about the time I turned 18 and went off to South Carolina State University, it was the first time anybody asked me, "Where are you from?" And for the last 30, 35 years, people constantly ask me where I'm from. They just assume that I'm actually from another country, which was surprising to me because I come from a very small community and everybody's your cousin. So I didn't feel that I looked that differently, but as I moved from South Carolina to North Carolina and then to Texas, the question still continued. So I decided in 2017 that I was going to take a DNA test because I wanted to know what everybody else saw in me that I didn't see in myself. And lo and behold, I was really surprised because I found made two major discoveries. Number one is that I am still, after my family having been here in this country since before the Revolutionary War, I am still 95% African. And all of the places that people thought that I was from showed up in my DNA. So that was pretty amazing to me. And then the other thing I realized shortly after getting the results from my test is that thousands and thousands of people were being added to the database as my family members. And I just couldn't figure out how was I related to people here in Texas, in Missouri, in Louisiana, where I never thought that I had any family. I thought my family was predominantly on the East Coast. And I knew about the Great Migration to the northern cities, but I didn't know about the migration down out west and then southerly. And that's when I discovered that there had been 2.5 million people who were born in this country of African descent, who were forcibly migrated all across the country after the invention of the cotton gin and at the end of the transatlantic slave trade. So I started working to figure out, how did this happen? And one of the most preeminent scholars, his name is Eric Foner, and Eric writes about slavery history and Reconstruction. So I work currently, my day job, because I work 24 hours, I think, but my day job is at Southern Methodist University. I work for the Center on Research and Evaluation. And I decided one rainy night, I decided all day, I'm not gonna go to this lecture. I'm just not gonna go. I'm tired, it's raining, it's gonna be late, I wanna go home. And something just sort of gave me the unction, just go, just go. So I go to this amazing lecture. It's everything I expected and more, because I, at this point, had been researching for about 2 years. And the things that he said in the lecture, it really spoke to what I had learned, and I knew that I was on the right track. So I remember getting up and asking a question, and I shared that I was from South Carolina before I asked my question. So at the end of the event, I was waiting for my husband, who's here with me today, Ray, to come and pick me up, and so I was gonna wait around. And there was a gentleman who was also waiting, just to kind of wait out the rain a little bit. And he came over and he said hello. And he asked me a question which just totally blew me away. He began to tell me a little bit about himself, and he just said, I have family from South Carolina. He says it's from a tiny little place. You might not know anything about it. He says, but it's Clarendon County, South Carolina. And I said to him, half of my father's DNA is from Clarendon County, South Carolina. So I am the great-granddaughter of Jesse Rames and Ella Rames, who are from Clarendon County, South Carolina, who moved to the small town that I was raised in. And so that's where my family originated, in Mullen, South Carolina. And that was my meeting with Jim. I'm gonna let you take it away.
And Jim, your side of this, you were waiting for coffee.
Yeah. That was a spectacular evening of immense importance to me. Maybe I started wading in the water that night. That was the theme of the sermon service, the whole service, beautiful service this morning. I have studied history much of my life, and Eric Foner, who was the lecturer, I knew to be the preeminent, he was really one of the first scholars who did honest scholarship about African American history in the South, and particularly in Reconstruction. There's a huge amount of dishonest history out there, particularly earlier. So I admired Foner and showed up for the event, and similar to, the serendipity of this is sort of wonderful. Similar to Pamela, I listened to it, I was thrilled with the presentation. Then I usually don't like to stand, I don't like to be around for the Q&As, because usually the Q is somebody there talking about themselves, mostly. They don't really have any.
Which we're going to avoid later, right?
Right. But I was sort of hemmed in. I was sitting, there were several people, I thought, well, I'm not going to disturb these people, and fauna was so good, I need to respect that. So I sat there. And then this extraordinary young woman starts presenting and telling some of the story you just heard there. And wow. Reminded me then of the first story that triggered my deep involvement in this. I was a young man, maybe my son's sitting right over here. Maybe Monty was even born then, and Monty's 56, I'm 83. So it was a while ago, but I was visiting with my family, 2 babies, at my mother and father's house in rural West Texas, right on the edge of cotton ranching country in the middle of nowhere. And as we were leaving, my mother motioned me very privately into her bedroom, and we went over to her chest of drawers, or as we call it, Chester drawers. I thought it was one guy, I thought it was Chester drawers. To her chest of drawers, and she pulled out a drawer, and underneath some of her clothing, there was a metal box about this big, a little metal kind of safe, and she had a key and opened it and pulled out of it an envelope that had some kind of writing in it, looked like and it was on blue paper. I remember that too, it's curious. And she said, I want you to have this. And I said, well, what is it? She said, I just want you to have it and to read it. Well, we left, and in a few days I opened it and discovered in there for the first time, I had no contemplation of this whatsoever, and here I was well in my 20s, maybe close to 30, that it was a will of my great-great-grandfather. And the will was executed just before his death, 1861, in Alabama. And the will then, that's exactly about when the war was beginning, and it was the end of his life. And the will made it very clear that, elaborately spelled out, that he owned a significant amount of land and a significant number of slaves. And many of the slaves were in Alabama, and some of them then were still in South Carolina, where through later on I was able to piece together many pieces. So I learned for the first time then that my family, it was my mother's side of my family, I was immensely close to them. I had my mother, like so many men, I thought my mother was, still do, the finest person I ever knew, you know. I loved her immensely. I was well loved. She had 2 brothers, neither of whom could have children, and so I was sort of the favorite nephew, and I was immensely close to these people, and I loved them as dearly as I could. And we had even named Monty, my son, sitting over there, Montgomery. That's his first name because that was my maternal mother's family name, and all my uncles who couldn't have children, I wanted Montgomery to be their name. Well then, suddenly here I am learning that this Montgomery family that I loved so dearly, it's not me, is it? Montgomery family had descended from slave owners, and that my grandfather, who died just the year before I was born, and after whom I was named, his name was Jim McFadden, middle name McFadden, which will show up again, last name Montgomery. He had lived his first 10 years of his life. This was my grandfather, who I didn't know, died just the year before I was born. I was named after him. He had lived the first 10 years of his life on a slave plantation in Alabama. And that his father, in turn, when he was 5 or 6, had joined the Confederate Army in Alabama and fought during the entire Civil War. Ended up being discharged in South Carolina, North Carolina, actually, after Appomattox. So that experience was startling. There had been no discussion whatsoever in my family, period whatsoever, about this part of our history. And the way I learned about it from my mother made it clear that it was secret. And she was turning it over to me and then we tried to talk about it later, but it was near the end of her life and her health was fading.
So Jim, let me stop you right there. So we've got two stories of two families trying to discover their past.
Yeah.
You've discovered more about your heritage and the location. You're discovering the slave owner past. And then let's get back to that meeting. What did you discover about each other in that meeting? Or did what you discover about your relationship come later?
Very good.
Maybe Pamela.
Well, one of the things that I think very soon after that meeting we realized is that we have family that is buried in the same cemetery. And so the likeliness of us even meeting in the first place, and then to know that our families were that closely related and lived within proximity of one another. And that's in Clarendon County, South Carolina. And then the other thing I've learned is that both the Montgomery and the McFadden families that are Jim's family, I have a cousin, a DeWitt cousin, who shared with me recently. I met him through my project, which is the Antebellum Diaspora Project. I met him and found out that his great-grandmother, Nellie Montgomery, is buried in a cemetery in Horry County, South Carolina. Most of you have heard of Myrtle Beach, that's Horry County. And it is a cemetery that goes back to slavery, and where the cemetery is like this, where you have the black family on one side and the white family on another. Nellie Montgomery, I found her on census records, and she is listed as a mulatto. And the white family made room and space for her in their part of the cemetery. So that says to me, and they acknowledge that we were indeed family. So learn that we, as far apart as we were, not knowing each other, just meeting each other for the first time, which is what I share with most people, is that we are so closely related we can't even imagine. And so Jim approached me with so much respect and humility about this history. So I would say the biggest takeaway was just that having the kind of empathy and humility to come together to talk about this difficult, history is what has brought us together as friends. And we say family because we feel like family. We know each other's families now.
Do you feel like family? Or you actually are family?
Well, I'll just say this. When I look at Jim's DNA, his history in the database, which is ancestry.com, his family has all of the surnames of my family.
Yeah.
And so even though there is a cutoff in terms of, how closely they will say that you're related, and we're still sort of looking at it because, again, I'm finding parts of my family all throughout Williamsburg County, Horry County, and Clarendon County that has the same names. And most of you all who know this history know that we, in many cases, our families, African-American families, took on the names of their slaveholders. And in most cases, my case is unusual. As I said, am 95% African still, but for most African-Americans who come through this legacy of slavery, they are 12 to 25% European. And that is because we were a family of slaveholders.
So the reason we're having this conversation is, on one hand, the assumption is that you are actually DNA related, but really, in a sense, that's important. The other side of this is that if we roll back time, Jim's family were the owners of your family, or in that enslaved diagram. Mm-hmm. And there was violence, there was pain, there was suffering, and so what does it mean for each of you today to be sitting here these hundreds of years later as friends and family thinking back on that history?
Let me elaborate a bit on the violence side of it. That, of course, is in many ways the most disturbing in the whole process of violence. But the particular violence, one of the things through Pamela's guidance, I have taken all the DNA testing and have received and discovered that I have at least a handful or more, and this is just through one service, a handful or more of probably third, fourth, and fifth cousins, and those are pretty good connections under the DNA. That the cousins where my DNA overlaps very strongly with theirs, and their DNA includes a significant portion of DNA from Northwest Africa, Nigeria, Guinea, and those sort of areas. So there is almost no question whatsoever that males in my family line were violating black women, slaves, in their lives. And so that evidence is not just, I knew it as a historian. I'd studied all this stuff and still do immensely. But there it is. There it is. So I'd like to end with that because that's about all I can say about this at this stage, and switch to Pamela and then.
Well, one of the things that I was amazed at, so when Jim, we met at a different occasion at SMU, and he brought some documents, a copy of the document that his mother had given to him. And we were talking about that. And so if you can imagine, since my family has been here on several sides since before the Revolutionary War, it's an immense family. And so my family tree, people everywhere. So when I knew that I'd grown up in a town that had some McFadden's in it. I knew a few Montgomerys, but it just never clicked. So when he gave me the information and said, Pamela, I would love to be able to find my information. So as much as you can give back to, African-American people so they can use this as a starting point for their research, that's what I'd like to happen. And I'm like, I know, this just sounds so strangely familiar. So then I just decided to go back and look at my family tree. So I shared with you at the beginning of this that I am the granddaughter of Ella Prince Rames. Well, Ella Prince's mother was Nancy McFadden. So my great-grandmother's mother was born into slavery, as were her parents, and they were enslaved by the McFaddens in Clarendon County. And so, again, it was just such, to me, almost overwhelming evidence that, oh my gosh, that our families were this closely related in all the same places and spaces. And again, for me, the big thing is that, as you've heard, Jim doesn't soft pedal truth. He tells the thing like it is. And for me, being a descendant of enslaved people and understanding and knowing through all history, all of their struggles and the things they have endured, it became a bonding agent. And like I said, we're friends and family for sure.
So there's a quality of, is there a quality of redemption in this for both of you?
And I want to be clear, it's not guilt. Let me just say that before you answer. One of the things that people, I would say on the other side of this history, are sometimes a little timid or a little afraid to talk about this history because they feel guilty about this history. And when I say to them, you weren't there. I wasn't there and you were not there. So we don't, as Megan Smolyanek, who's an amazing genealogist, says, we don't get to necessarily laud all the amazing things that our ancestors did, and we also don't get to take the blame. But what we do is take the responsibility of knowing that if you have information that you can share about your family, that would help people like me find my family. Because again, you know, between 1810 and 1865, when there was 1865 at the end of slavery, there were 4 million African American people who were born in this country during that time, during emancipation. 2.5 million of those people have been forcibly migrated, either across the state or across state lines. And so what most people don't realize is that our families were separated forever. They were separated forever. And so to this day, you know, we don't know our family in Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia. But in order for people to really sort of rally around this cause of reconnecting families, gotta get rid of the guilt, gotta get rid of the shame, which is very different from redemption.
I'm not sure what redemption is. I've been searching for the right words, the right descriptions of the feelings that all of this has generated. Pamela's been spectacularly helpful in that, making it very clear to me that her attitude was not one of finding me today individually guilty. Fortunately, Pamela's become good friends with many of my kids and grandkids, and in fact, it was one of my granddaughters who was at college. Fortunately, within my family, once I learned this information, it has been open book. I mean, I have told everybody in my family, we tried to figure out when did we start talking about it, but as soon as my children could understand it, I have a sister with a big family, and so we've all shared that information widely. Startlingly, because it was such a secret. I mean, we just didn't know anything about it. But what's the right word? Is it redemption? There was the shame element, of course. Shame, you know, there's also, you have to try to reconcile. As a historian, I've studied it a lot, and, you know, these were evil times and evil cultures, and people were living in the wrong time. And you could try to come up with some ways to, you know, at least comprehend and understand how this ancestral line of people who I love and whose DNA I share extremely, how they could have been involved with all that. So what are the right words? It was one of my granddaughters, Monty's daughter, Ashley, who has become friends of Pamela, and Pamela's niece. I mean, we are family, I promise you. But it was Ashley who was at school at Davidson in North Carolina, very close to where you went to school. She was talking to one of her professors, and the professor said, well, what is going on, this was before we met Pamela, is that try to get as much information as you can into the hands of people who are working with this information so that it might be useful to them in helping track their family. And so Ashley came up with the idea. We were just sort of floundering. What do we, you know, how do you got all these feelings, but what do you do about it? And we were comfortable and eager even to share the story. But then that came up with the idea, and then all of a sudden we're at the phoner meeting, and there's this opportunity. I think redemption, there's something wonderful about releasing this secret.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know what the right word is,
Yeah.
but and then finding Pamela and her warmth and her ability to help track all this together and weave together these beautiful stories. Two stories of wading in the water that I was thinking about in the service today. This part of Carolina where our families mixed waded in the water together probably, is called the Petey River. And that's sort of an identification. And I was, and the slaves were working in the waters and the rivers so much. And then the part in Alabama where it was critical was on the Alabama River, which is in the black heart of Alabama with the blackest land and the blackest people. And it was on this river that went down to Mobile. So the wading in the water, our ancestors, and yours more than mine, or mine or yours now, I mean, we're all together, we're literally wading in those rivers.
So the fruits of this story, I think, come in a couple different ways, and you correct me if I'm wrong. There's been a lot of washing of stories of slavery, right? Even back in Frederick Douglass named those who attempted to wash slavery apostles of forgetfulness, who built monuments to their willful amnesia.
Willful amnesia.
And so if Frederick Douglass is talking about that back then, we got that in spades now, right? We've got presidents who are, saying slave owners were great people, and we've got political leaders saying critical race theory is an evil, and apostles of forgetfulness. So in part, one of the fruits of your story is to counter that narrative, right? So this is a beautiful moment, actually. I mean, those of you who are witnessing this, I know you two have spoken before, but for us, this is a counter to the apostles of forgetfulness. We are apostles of remembrance. And there's a beautiful fruit there. The other one I see is just your friendship. So I witnessed that in our pre-conversations and in what you've said about your families. What other fruits of this unfolding story are there? And what do we do with your story?
So for me, one of the reasons that I'm doing this is to restore humanity to people who lived, in this country for hundreds of years, who never got their just due. And I want people to understand that when, we tell stories about forced migration, that literally means, I've had the blessing of being married to my husband for 31 years. We got married when we were 7, right? And,
He looks a little older.
And the thought that, the average marriage of Black people on plantations lasted about 8 years. And it wasn't because marriages fell apart. It was because partners were sold away. I think about the fact that I've had the blessing of raising 2 amazing children. Both of my kids are SMU grads. My son went to graduate school at Yale University. My daughter, who's my photographer, who's doing the work for me today, just graduated from Southern Methodist University. But I realize this informs my humanity, and it connects me because I've had the blessing of raising my own children and being in places and spaces that my family could have never imagined. And so again, it's a way for me to help people understand that these are not just, as of 1870, they're not just names on census records or, if it's a manifest of a ship, not just slave ships coming from Africa or from the Caribbean. There was a lot during the antebellum slave trade. People were sent from state to state.
Down the river.
Down the river. Right. And so I see my great-great-grandfather, Amos, and I see his brother, Barney, on those manifests and what that meant to my family. So it is just, like I said, for me, just a way of restoring. That's one of the fruits for people to be reunited with this history, to see my people as fully human. And again, just to understand that some of the songs, some of the stories that you've heard, all of these years, they're related to this history. Can I do a little bit of something?
You're going to sing for
I'm
us?
going to sing.
Yeah, you're a singer-songwriter.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to do that.
But there's a song that I would venture that everybody in this room knows. I'm going to ask for you to raise your hands if you've ever heard the song Kumbaya.
Sure.
Okay. I'm going
You
to ask
didn't have,
you.
these people were marching in the 60s. Come on.
Okay. But probably before the 60s, if you were a Girl Scout or a Boy Scout, is that where you learned it? Raise your hand if you learned it there. Okay. How many people have sort of the idea that kumbaya, basically means we're going to have a come to Jesus meeting and we're going to get along? That's what most people understand. And that is not what the song means, right? So what kumbaya means to my family and people who were enslaved in the Carolinas and on seacoast islands from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Kumbaya comes from the Gijagala culture. There were people who were isolated on these seacoast islands, and they were coming from several different countries in Africa, so they didn't have a common language. So they were brilliant enough to infuse English with several different words, well, about 4,000 words from within the different cultures, so that they could speak in the presence of a slave master without the slave master knowing what they were talking about. So kumbaya is actually a direct request to God that we are going through so much hurt and pain and turmoil that kumbaya would just come by here. So, and it was done in a call and response way. So somebody would say, somebody needs you, Lord. And the rest of the folks would say, kumbaya. Somebody needs you, Lord. Kumbaya. Somebody needs you, Lord. Kumbaya. Oh, Lord. Kumbaya. So there is, if you all don't know this, there is for every slaveholding state, there is in the Library of Congress, you can find it online, loc.gov, it is slavery narratives. So these are people who were alive in the 1930s as a part of the Federal Writers Project. They went around to communities and they recorded interviews with formerly enslaved people that had been children. I have several family members that were included in those recordings, including my great-grandmother, Elvira Grant, her older brother. And I've been able to visit that plantation. So he tells a story in this slave narrative from South Carolina about seeing his mother stripped and whipped and tied to a post on a plantation that I got to visit just a few months before I got a chance to meet Jim. And so she was known as a healer on the plantation. So when somebody was in her predicament, she was the person who prepared the herbs and the salves to sort of help heal, the whipped places on the body. So when I saw that, I imagined, the other women from her community untying her from that post and taking her to one of those rough cabins and singing over her as they were trying to help heal her. We're down here praying, Lord, kumbaya. We're down here praying, Lord, kumbaya. We're down here praying, Lord, kumbaya. Oh, Lord, kumbaya. So the next time you hear that song, I want you to know the depth of where that song comes from. And it was changed and put into camp books by the daughter of a slaveholder who wanted to sort of take away this history so that it could take away the stain of slavery from her family. But now you can't unknow what
Next
you
time
know.
they hear that, you and I are going to be standing in church.
Okay.
Jim, what comes out of this story that you and Pamela are in for you? What are the fruits? What are the fruits?
Well, it's an ongoing story.
Yeah.
And this is one of the fruits. I'm delighted and thrilled and proud of our church and our community to be hosting us. Thank you, Daniel, for arranging it, and thank you, Pamela, again and again and again for so many things. Pamela and I talk about it as to where do we go from here. Part of what I've done with it, and I know my family's done with it, is to tell the story widely among whatever communities we're a part of. I'm at a book club of mostly old men. Been meeting for 25 or 30 years, a bunch of terrific guys, of course. And I've told the story there, and in that group of 15 people, two men responded saying, one of them said, "Oh my goodness, my great-grandfather," or whatever it was, "brought to Dallas County 50 slaves in whatever year it was." And another one didn't respond well. He said, "Well, one of my grandfathers was a Presbyterian minister, and he had slaves, but he was a wonderful slave owner and was well renowned by everybody that he was there." I said, "That's bullshit. That's what that is." I don't know if that's proper in Channing Hall, but that's what it was. So
In here, it's okay.
it's in here, so okay. So I think the truth and dispersing it in any manner that we can, and that's why we appreciate this offering, is foremost.
Yeah.
And how we do that, Pamela's even been thinking of, possibly a book. We're probably going to travel together as soon as COVID and everything, if it ever calms down, to South Carolina and visit some of these, like the Montgomery and the McFadden's and the Durant graveyards, where we know our ancestors are buried. And Pamela's a woman of phenomenal energy and creativity, as you can tell, and skills. And I'm sort of tagging along, honestly. So where is it going? Only God knows.
Okay. Let's take some questions. We got about 15 minutes. I'm hoping that you're sitting there, you're thinking of things that I'm not asking. So I want to just invite you, if you have a question, just to stand up and ask it. I don't have a microphone to give you, so Pamela?
Hi, I'm Pamela Weiss, and I'm a member of the church. And I'd like you, Pamela, to repeat the name of the genealogy source at the Library of Congress.
Right, it's at the Library of Congress. You can just look LOC.gov, and you can just, in the search engine, just put in slave narratives. And then it will let you search it by state. And each of those narratives, those books, are actual physical books. Some of the genealogy libraries, I would dare say probably on the 5th floor at the Dallas Library, they have a huge genealogy department. Probably also have the physical form of the books as well, especially for Texas. And you will be able to find that information. And so these narratives are so largely informative. And so again, just reading the one narrative from my great-great-uncle Charlie, I was able to identify the plantation, which I had driven by, my whole childhood, and never knew that my family had a connection there. And my family's cemetery is actually on this property. But I also found out that there were 2 other nearby plantations that don't exist, but I found out the name of those slaveholders. So also, my family is Wilson, and my family is Grant. And because I read that narrative, he had even said in the narrative, he was about 5 or 6 years old at the time of emancipation, that he used to ride carts under the house, the porch. The homes there are built on pier beam structures. And so they sit really high because there was no air conditioning back then. It would let the air sort of blow through to cool the homes. And so when I read this and I went to the house and I asked the present owner, who's only the second family who's owned this home that my family built, by the way, I was able to touch the walls and the doors and the things that my family had built. And when I asked her about that, she said, "Oh, we have access." So I actually got to go in and stand in the place that my great-great-uncle Charlie had stood in. So there are lots of information in that narrative. And I will say, for those of you who are Texas born, we have family here that are from several generations. So many of the families have come here from the East Coast, Alabama, Mississippi. And so even when I sing some of the other songs that are more widely known in the African American community. Most of those audiences know the songs, and I say to them, how do you know that song? Well, my great grandmother used to sing that song, and I say to them, it's because your family are from all the places that my family are from. So when they couldn't travel with their family, they brought their music and their stories with them. So we're all connected, and there's a lot to learn in those narratives.
Great, good, thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christy.
And I'm going to repeat the question just for the recording, so go ahead.
Okay, I'm Christy with our church, Unitarian. My question is about secrecy and the depth of secrecy and the damage of secrecy on generations. I'm working in the Bonton community in South Dallas, and this is kind of the reverse side. This is a young African-American man, 30, and his family won't tell him about his past. And he's really struggling with that. So how has secrecy worked with both of you and your families?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there is a theme of secrecy, at least certainly in Jim, your story, that the symbol of the little silver box tucked in the drawer with a key is like every family secret that everyone in this room, has ever approached, right? How does it work on your side?
Well, there's a lot of secrecy. I think if you ask any African American person in this room today, we all had a great or great great grandmother who our family said was Native American, and she had such long hair that she could sit on it. Like we all, no matter where I go to speak, we all have that great great grandmother. And so, much like my husband, who's been told his entire life that
He hasn't got any hair.
Right, right. But his family has always told him that he was of Native descent. And so for most of us, because of how we became mixed with European blood, our families hid it from us by making that great-great-grandmother Native as opposed to being white. Because then they would have to explain the assaults. And it's a difficult subject to broach. And so we do have our secrets. And then I will tell you, I talked earlier about taking away the shame. There are people, because this history has been so hidden from us as a part of our education, that they think all we ever were enslaved people. One of the things I found most interesting in the place where my family had been enslaved is that we're not down, we're a little north of Charleston, and we are landlocked with North Carolina. So in order to grow rice, like the Carolina Gold, you have to, be close to a waterway. But then we found out that there was a particular grain of rice called the blue rose rice. It was a grain that had a little slight blue tint on the inside until you cooked it. And they were able to grow rice there because the enslaved people brought over with them information of how to do irrigation. And so that's how slaveholders became wealthy, because these Africans had such great knowledge about something that they had no knowledge of. And so just, again, they were never just anything. Again, most people think that most enslaved people, that they were all in the fields. They were highly skilled laborers. They did work with ironwork. They were seamstresses, and for generations sewed the ball gowns for governors' wives. They did a great many things. So by not telling the whole history, we leave a part of the people who are affected by this, some living in shame, thinking that this is all we ever were. And that just absolutely is not true.
Great answer on that. You talked about this already, I think. Should we go on to another question? Or?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Robert. I'm a member here. Haven't been in a while, but I'm back.
Good.
Yay.
So I and a cousin of mine have been working on our genealogy. I've run into a snag on my father's side. He was adopted, and I don't know a whole lot about his biological family. But on my mother's side, way more information. I too have a native great-grandmother, the long great.
Okay.
But I'm curious, I'm doing all this as a way to leave a legacy for my children so that they don't ever have to wonder where they came from. Or your families continuing the search, do they plan to continue to record? And
So let me just repeat that question. So the question is, in a sense, you're doing a bunch of genealogy, but the question is, are you also passing on this passion for the genealogy? I mean, is this going to continue with your children and Monty and your child here, others? Should we ask them? Or?
Did you want to start?
Well, I think so, and I hope so. I have 4 grandkids now, all in their 20s, and all of them very well acquainted with the story. I have not only told stories about it, I've written a lot of, short things. I'm never sure any of my grandchildren read anything that I send them, of course, but occasionally I know they do. And like one granddaughter who came up with this, she was talking to her professor, and the professor's the one that came up with the idea, well, you need to get all this data, and then that's part of what led to Pamela. But also out of that, this same granddaughter was dealing with it on her social media, and she identified another young woman who she knew, didn't know well, but knew in the college where she was, and communicated this story and said, do any of you have this same kind of information? And so this young woman then provided us access to her uncle, who, my goodness, he knew everything about everything. And then Pamela and I actually talked with him. And he's working very diligently, and their focus was mostly in Virginia. So I think so. I would be surprised if it's not a continued passion. And also, again, history generally is a passion of mine and most of my family, and so it fits within that. So I'm very hopeful that it will broaden and continue.
Well, history was not a passion of mine, let me say. As you can tell, my family, they're very artsy. I love music, and that was sort of what was passed down. But I realized that I wasn't interested in history because we just weren't in it. But once I started doing this, and I am working towards a film, Information Wanted, because I want this information to be widely known, because most Americans, not even just most African Americans, but most Americans are not aware of a lot of the history. But I just, I lost my point, I'm sorry. Just in terms of it being widely known. So what I've been able to find out about my family is so interesting. So I do a lot of information sharing on social media, and I do that to pique people's interest, because I know that there are people that are interested who may not know where to start. So some of the interesting things that I found about my family is that my family was involved in the Revolutionary War, except we fought for the other side. So those who were enslaved, when they heard the revolutionists talking about, they felt like England was treating them like slaves, they were like, what? And so it made them, and again, because of some of the players that were in the Revolutionary War who were, had been loyal to England, England was very upset with them. So like for Pierce Butler in Georgia, they, sort of parked a ship out there and made it known that if you will give us intel, or if you will fight for us, or even if you can just make your way to the ship, we will give you passage to Canada. And so when I started using the DNA is such a great tool for those parts that you can't find, because people in every part of this puzzle are looking. And so I kept finding my family in Nova Scotia. Port Royal, just different places. And so when I asked, I was contacted by a Canadian newspaper, and I was sharing about all the different places. And she says, these are all places that were settlements for people who fought against the revolutionists for Britain, and they got safe passage to Canada. And so I'm finding parts of my family history. Brown versus the Board of Education. That case, first case, was in Clarendon County, South Carolina. I'm related to the Briggs family, who was a part of that lawsuit. And so I'm finding my family all over American history. So that's made it exciting for me. So I will probably spend the rest of my career writing and talking and, creating art around this. So it will definitely live on.
That's great. Thank you. Besides talking to you about inviting me to the next family dinner with you two and your families, I'd love to be there. What's the last thing you want to tell us today?
I'm gonna let you start, Jim.
Last thing I want to tell us.
I mean,
Well, I would like to, somewhere in our service this morning, there was a comment, I can't remember who it was on the screen, but he talked about working within the community that you live in, the process. Obviously, this issues that we're dealing with are so mammoth, but it's an old adage that we've all heard, but think global and act local. We've all heard that all our lives. But I think that's what hopefully I would encourage each of us to do here today. And the technology is so readily available right now to be able to identify information. And the compounding impact of this, say through your activities, and then maybe that affects your children's and your grandchildren's, and you're going to run into lots of dead ends. The whole concept of doing genealogical work, I don't like that. It doesn't interest me. But fortunately, there are people who do it beautifully well, and the cost is not prohibitive at all. And so give it a thought, give it a chance, pursue it a little bit. And I think you may be like I was, surprised, maybe distressed, but it is worth the journey, I promise you. And genealogy by itself doesn't necessarily do much, but when you put all that information into context, like Pamela's so able to do, context of what was going on to those people in those places at that time, put it in the historical context, and you put the story together, it's a spectacular story for all of us, every single human being. So I'd encourage, think local, act local, think global.
I have a question.
just, can you hold it? Can you hold it?
Where do you go with that?
Where's a good place to go to start genealogy? Is it the DNA testing?
Well, it can be, you can start, well, the DNA testing helps immensely, because if you take the DNA test, and I have my DNA in several different databases, and they are very reliable. And if you leave it open, then people will be able to find you and have access to you, which kind of brings me to the point that you just asked me, actually, a good question.
Yeah.
So people ask me, what can I do? One of the things that you can do, if you are interested in genealogy research, which so many people are, I just found out over the last few years that it is one of the most popular hobbies in this country, that when you find documents for your family, if it's a will, if it's something from an estate, you can make notes on most genealogy websites. And if there are names of enslaved people, even if they're just first names or ages that are listed, connect that information to the person in your family. Because what I have found is that in most cases, particularly during migration as the country was growing westerly, is that where your families were, my families will be also. So every little bit of information helps. I think, another takeaway is just to take the shame out of this, to be honest with your families. No, this was not just the greatest moment in history for our families, but it happened. And while we cannot erase what has happened, what we can do now that you know that we are trying to find our families, is just to be, a soldier in that army. To basically say, again, can't right or wrong. It's not even your responsibility so much, to right the wrong, but just as a human family, to do everything that you can to let people, be reconnected again. And so it's been amazing. I want to tell you that I found a young man in North Carolina. My family's from South Carolina. When my brother sent me a picture of the young man, they are almost identical. They could be twins. And they have lived in the same city for 20 years and have never met each other. But his family was taken from Marion County, which is now Dillon County, South Carolina, up to the northern part of the state of South Carolina and eventually into Mecklenburg County in the 1850s. And we have been disconnected for all of these years. So every little bit of information that you can share. And just like Jim, I have found some great friends on the other side of this history just because they are willing to share, they're very humble, and they're very honest about this history. And those are the kinds of things that bring people together. And anybody can participate in that.
Yeah. So James Baldwin said, beyond all of this, the thing we have to do is build a better world, one person at a time, or working on this together. And I thank you for being apostles of remembrance and for being with us and for singing with us and being on the front porch today. So will you give them a... Thanks for coming, everybody, to the front porch. There'll be more. There'll be some in the near future.